If you are a ETL tester or a database developer, please do not skip this video. In this video, we are going to learn about a tool which is very powerful when it comes to generating mockup data. So make sure you watch the entire video. Hi, I am Bindu Kumar and I welcome you to my channel. In my previous video, we looked at a tool called Fake2DB. Fake2DB is a very simple and easy to use command line utility through which you can generate mockup data. In case you haven't seen that video, the link is in the video description and it should appear on your screen as well. Fake2DB, although it's very simple and easy to use, it does have some limitations. For example, for the data that you need to generate, you only have to choose from a standard list of attributes such as first name, last name, credit card, email. What if you have attributes that are not part of this list? Well, Fake2DB cannot help you there. Also, the datasets that Fake2DB generates are isolated. Now, what does this mean? Suppose you have a database with 5 tables, and all of these 5 tables have some kind of a primary key, foreign key relationship between them. Using Fake2DB, you can generate data for each of these tables one at a time. However, there is no way to ensure that this data can actually be joined and if the values will overlap between them. So these are some of the limitations of Fake2DB. At the end of my previous video, I also did mention that there is another utility that is way more powerful, way more sophisticated, and gives you a lot of control over this data generation. And that's what this video is about. So the tool that we are going to look at today is Synth. Synth, I suppose, stands for synthetic. It's a free and open source tool. You will find its code in their GitHub page. The URL is in the video description. It's a tool that can be used from the command line, very similar to Fake2DB. Just like Fake2DB, Synth also accepts a set of attributes, but the similarities end there. Synth also gives you a lot of control over the characteristics of the data generation, such as making sure all the data that is generated in a column is unique. So there are many other features that we are going to look at. So let's get started. So the first step towards getting started with Synth is obviously to download it. So to do that, go to their website, which is getsynth.com. You will find the URL in the description. Once you're in the home page, you will see this download button on the top right. It's called Get Synth. Click on that. Once you're in this page, you will see a download Synth button, but I would ask you to click on this other button. You see this not running Windows C other installation options. Click on other. It takes you to the documentation getting started page. From here, go to Windows and click on the download button here. So the executable is around 18 MB in size. So it should just take few seconds or minutes to download. You can see it's already downloaded on my machine, but it has a little lengthier name, Synth Windows Latest x86-64. So what I've done is I've made a copy of this file and renamed it to just synth.exe. So that's about it. I mean, we just have to download this file. There is nothing really to install for the Synth. The next thing that you need is you need a bunch of files that will help you get started with Synth. So to help you out, I have prepared all these files and you can download them from my GitHub repository page. So if you go to my GitHub page, the link is in the description. So here there are 2 files under folder. So you have the dbscripts.sql, synth commands, and then there is a customer folder which has, I believe, 5 JSON files. So just download all of these into the same folder where you have downloaded the synth executable. Although the synth executable and the files are enough to get started, you also need a database because it is very good to see the data that is generated in a database. So for this, you need a PostgreSQL database. Here you have a lot of options. You can either choose a database that you have installed, or if you want a temporary database, then you can spin one in Docker, exactly what I have done. So here you can see there is a Postgres running in Docker. It has a couple of databases, but let us create a new database. I'm going to call it mockup data. And if you're going to copy the exact commands from my video, make sure you give the exact same database name, mockup data. Okay, so with this we have created an empty database, and as you can see, there is no other schema apart from the public schema, and even the public schema has no objects in it. So it's a brand new database. So we'll come back to this later. Now let's come back to this folder where we have placed the synth. What we have to do is we'll open up a command line in this path. Let's minimize this. And we'll go to the synth commands.txt. Now this is a file that you have downloaded from my GitHub repo. Here, let's look at the first command. Synth is the name of the executable. Generate is the command. And at the extreme end of the command, you see a keyword called customer. So what does this mean? Synth generate customer. By mentioning customer, we are telling Synth that in the same path where synth is there, right? In that same path, there is a folder called customer, right? And in that folder, or we want synth to treat this folder as the schema of a database. Okay, so it will treat this as a schema of a database. And also in between, we have mentioned -- collection, which is a parameter, and we are saying customer v1. So this is a way of telling synth that customer is a schema. It might have multiple collections. However, in this command, I only want to generate data for this one collection, and every collection is an equivalent of a table, right? So, the best way to understand this better is just to run this command. So we are going to copy this and let's head over to the command line, hit enter. So I can see within a second, it generated 2 records, joe@example.org and kara@example.com, right? Let's run it one more time and I'm getting the same data again. So now let's try to understand what is inside this customer_v1 JSON file that ensures that data like this is generated. So going back to the Notepad++, let me double click the customer v1.json. As you can see, this is a standard JSON file, and there are 3 top level root elements. There are 3 root level elements, which are type, length, and content. Content being the most important one. Let us look at that first. So content, it's of the type object. And within this, we have to embed all the different attributes for which we want to generate the data. For example, you can see customer ID. We are saying customer ID is the name of the attribute that we want to mention. Along with this, we are also saying it is of the string data type, and the data for this should be generated using a faker generator called safe email. You see, safe email is one from a standard list of attributes or standard list of generators that Synth supports. So just like safe email, you'll also have first name, last name, credit card, email ID, and so on. I will show that entire list a little later in this video. But for now, as you can see, we are telling Synth that generate records where there is an attribute called customer ID, and the values generated should be of the type safe email. Okay. Now let's look at the other 2 elements, the length and the type. Type is always an array. This is pretty much fixed. There are no changes that you will ever do here. And now coming to the length. You see, anytime you are generating mockup data, you often have to define how many records you want to generate, whether it's 1 record, 2 record, 20,000 records. That specification is mentioned within this particular JSON element. So you can see there is a low, there is a high, and you can see the type is a number, subtype is an unsigned 64. What the low and high means is you can mention what is the minimum number of records you want to generate and what is the maximum number. So here we have just given 2 and 3, and that's why you saw in the command line that it was generating 2 records most of the time. And also we have mentioned a step of 1, which means that we are telling Synth that the range between 2 and 3 should only be incremented one at a time. There's nothing like 2.1 or 2.3. It's either 2 or 2 plus 1, which is 3. So this is called a step 1. But again, in case you don't get it, don't worry about it. Low and high is what you need for most of your use cases. Now let's get back to the command line. So you can see again the same 2 records are generated. But you see, when we talk about mockup data generation, it's not about generating data in a command line. We want something beyond. We want the data to be directly created in a database. So how do we go about that? So to do that, let's go to the database, and here we're going to create some tables in the mockup data. Right now it's empty, but let's create those tables. So for that, in the files that you have downloaded from the GitHub repository, there is a file called dbscripts.sql. So I have it open in my notepad here. Okay, so you can see it generates a few tables which are all empty. So it just generates the table, but there's no data that's populated in it. Copy the entire script. Let's go back to dbeaver or any database client that you might be using, and I'll paste it here and execute all of these. Okay, so this will create a new schema called customer data, and here you can see all the tables as well. And looking at the size, you can realize that these tables are empty. I mean, it's just the data table definition, but really no data in it. So this is to help you with with learning the synth as quickly as possible. Okay, so now that we are done, I will close this file. I no longer need that. Now let's come back to the notepad and to the synth commands. Now it's time to look at command number 2. Before we can execute this, let's understand what is happening here. It's very similar to the previous command. Synth executable generate is the command, and at the very end of the command, we are still calling the schema, which is customer. Okay, now in between, let's see what's happening. In between, we are saying the collection is customer v1. Now by now, if you have observed, this customer table has many collections: address v1, customer v1, 2, 3, 4. But here we are saying that we only want to generate data for customer v1. The next parameter is schema customer data. Now, as you can guess, by mentioning this, we are saying that when you're writing the data to the Postgres, make sure you push this data into the customer data schema, because a Postgres database may have multiple schemas. Here, we are clearly calling out the schema in which the data has to be generated. And then the URL. So we are using the parameter 2 to give the URL of the Postgres in the JDBC format. So you're saying Postgres, username, password, localhost, port, and then the name of the database. So now you can relate why we created a database called mockup data. Also, we are also mentioning an additional parameter which we have not used before, which is size 30. So let's take this entire command and see how it works. So I'm going to copy this into the command line, hit enter. It took less than a second. Now, but there is nothing to see here in the command line because all of the data has been written to the database. So let's verify that. So I'm going to go to the database. You can see the table size is still empty, probably because it's not refreshed. Let me refresh this table, and you can see there is a slight increase in the customer v1. Earlier it was 8K, now it is 16K. Let me right click, view data, and you will see 30 email IDs that have been generated and stored in this table. Now let's go back to the command line and re-execute the command, that same command, without making any changes whatsoever. All right, so it's completed. Going back to the database, if I just hit refresh here, I can see another 30 records that have been added to the database. Now the first thing, what does this size 30 mean? This is a parameter that we did not use in the previous command. The size 30 is a parameter that helps you override whatever limits you might have set in the JSON. So here we are mentioning only 2 and 3, a low of 2 or a minimum of 2 and a maximum of 3 records. But by mentioning or explicitly sending this parameter, which is size 30, we are overriding those details and we are telling Synth that irrespective of what is there in the JSON, I want you to generate these many records. In this case, it is 30. Now I can run this command again. And if I go back to the database, you will see another 30 records that have been added to this table. So you see how simple and easy it is to generate data into the database. But here, let me call out one small problem. You see, every time you call the synth command, iteratively, it tends to generate the same data. For example, the first 2 records are Joe and Kara. If I scroll down to 31 and 32, you see it's the exact same data again, right? Which might be a problem. Now, how do we control this? How do we make sure that the data that is generated is unique? So to do this, let's look at our second command or second JSON file. So that would be my apologies. That is the third command. We have already seen 2 commands. Let's look at command number 3. Command number 3 is very similar to the previous command. It's synth generate, schema, customer data. It's all the same. The only difference is this customer_v2. So now it's a new collection, a different JSON file. So let's understand what is inside this JSON file. So this is customer_v2.json. Again, let me just collapse the type and the length because there is not much of a difference there. Let's look at the content. In the content, if I just highlight this part, the string and safe email, you'll see this exactly similar to the first JSON file, the customer_v1. But here you will observe that this entire JSON is enclosed within another JSON or nested within another JSON where we are saying type is unique. Type is unique, right? So what it means is all the data that is going to get generated or all the emails that will be generated here, the synth will ensure that the data before it is tagged to this customer ID attribute, a unique constraint is applied on it. So which means only unique email IDs are generated. Okay. So let's see this in action. So we are going to the synth commands. Let's copy this. So pasted the command here, and instead of 30, let's increase it to 100 records. Right. Again, whether it's 1 or 100 records, it just took a second. Let's go back to the database and customer v2. I'll just refresh it once. You'll see the size increased to 32K. Let's view the data. And here you can already observe the pattern is slightly different from the previous tables, right? In this customer v2, there are 100 email IDs, or I think a lot more than that. Right. So there are more than 100 email IDs and all of them are unique. And how do I know? How can you say that all of these records are unique without actually running some kind of query on it, right? So what you'll see here is in the customer v2 table, I have already created an index, which is nothing but a primary key constraint on this particular column, which is the customer ID. Of course, there's just one column here. On this column, I have declared a primary key, which means if synth had sent duplicate records to this table, the database would have straight away thrown an error. The very fact that we didn't see any errors, it means that all of the records here are already unique and adhering to the primary key constraint. So that's the beauty of Synth. It takes control of the data generation, based on whatever requirements you put through before the data can be output. So far we have covered 3 commands: how to generate data in the command line, how to push the data to a database, and also how to generate data that is unique. Let's look at few more examples. So let's start with command number 4. Command number 4 is again very similar to the command number 3, but this time it is another JSON called v3. So let's see what is new in this customer_v3 JSON. Here the type and length remain the same, so I'm not going to talk about it. Let's talk about the content. So in the content we have the customer ID, and here you can see it's inherited from the previous JSON, meaning we not only have the CF email generator, but we also have the unique constraint here. So that's already taken care of. In addition to this, we are now adding 2 more attributes, the first name and the last name. And you can see we are using the generator first name, last name. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Synth has a standard set of attributes from which you can choose. So here we are using 3 of those attributes: safe email, first name, and last name. So let's run this command and see what the data looks like. So I'm going to copy this, and in the command line, let's increase the size to 100 records. All right, so that's done. Let's go to the customer v3, refresh just to make sure the data has been updated, and let's look at the data. So here you can see the customer ID, first name, and last name, and there is a primary key constraint on the customer ID which is already applied. And you do see this behavior where Synth creates a bit more data than you actually specified. Like for example, here it has created 120 records. I'm not exactly sure how that is being created. That's something that I'm looking at. Perhaps I'll have an update on it in my later videos. Okay, so with this example, we have seen how to add multiple attributes. So I think you get the idea. From here, you can keep adding as many attributes you want in the data set. Now let's look at another JSON, which is customer_v4. So in the v4 JSON, again, I'm not going to talk about type and length. Let's look at the content. In the content, you have the usual customer ID. You have the first name and last name. So we added a couple of attributes. So the first attribute is customer since. Let's suppose we want to track since when an individual has been a customer with us. Preferably the date. And let's say we started our retail operation sometime in 1980 and we are still going as of 2000. So what we have to tell Synth is it is of the type date time, and it should be of this particular format, YYYMMDD, and the subtype is a naive date. And we can also mention a range. See, this is very important because if you do not specify this range, what's going to happen is the Synth will generate dates that can be anywhere in the calendar. It could be in the future, it could be 300 years before, which doesn't make sense because for our need, the business has started from 1980 onwards. So which is why Synth gives you this option. You can give a begin and end. So here you can see we have given 1980 as the beginning and 2000 at the end, which means Synth is only going to generate data within this particular boundary condition, which is of immense use, especially when it comes to strict data quality for this mockup data. Otherwise, you're going to end up with some random data which doesn't make any sense to either the developer or the tester. Next, we have added a customer gender. Customer gender, right? So here, there is a special operator called one-off, right? So we are mentioning one-off, meaning select one of the value from a list of variants. And here you'll have to mention the variants. So now, as you can imagine, this variants is a key that you will only use if the type is one-off. This really cannot be applied anywhere else. And within the variant, which is an array, by the way, you have to mention the different types. So for first we have mentioned a string type with a pattern of either male or female. Okay, and we have also given another variant which is of a type null. And for both of these variants, we are giving a weight of 0.5 and 0.5, which means the values can either be M or F, or it can be null. And the probability of a null appearing is 50%, and the probability of a male or female appearing is 50%. So this way you can very well, not only simulate the data quality, but also control it to, to what degree should the data quality reflect that of a real world. Because this gender is an attribute in many, it used to be mandatory, but there are some systems in which gender is not mandatory, meaning the customer may not want to reveal it, and they may want to keep it as just as null. So all of those real world conditions, you can very easily express it as a JSON configuration. And then finally, the last attribute, which is customer UUID. So the UUID is a universal identifier. It is a alphanumeric string that is generated, which is guaranteed to be unique. All right. So these are the new attributes that we have added in the customer v4. Now let's run this command and see how it works. So here I'm going to copy this command under command 5. And let me take it to the command line. And here the size, we will give it as 200. Okay, there you go. Now it's done. Let's go to the database. And if I were to refresh the stats of customer v4, you can see it's 96K, which definitely means data has been added. And here you can see the customer ID, first name, last name, customer since. And if you observe the customer since, you will see every date is within the boundary condition that we have mentioned. Similarly, the customer gender also, you see almost an equal distribution of the male, the female, as well as the null values across all the records that are there. Finally, the customer UUID. The customer UUID, as I said, is a global identifier. It is supposed to be a unique system generated value. And even without looking at it, I know it is unique. Why? Because I have specified a primary key constraint on this particular table. And if you can see, you can see a small icon right next to the customer UUID. So customer UUID has already been marked as a primary key, and Synth has added the values, which means all of these values are indeed unique. So this is how you can generate anywhere from simple datasets to complex datasets while having a lot of control over how the data is generated. Now comes the most important part, which is really a USP of Synth. Let's look at the address v1 table. Address, if I expand it, it has two attributes: customer UUID and customer address. And we want the UUID here to match with the UUID of, let's say, the customer v4 table. So that way we can join the customer v4 and address. But as of now, the address table is all empty. It has no data in it. So let's start with populating data for address v1. If you go back to the JSON files, there is one file for address, which is address_v1.json. And here again, it's the type and the length at the beginning. We can collapse that. Let's look at the content. Within the content, we have a customer address as the last attribute or the second attribute. Here we are using the generator of address, which is straightforward, nothing to explain here. But let's look at the first attribute, which is customer UUID. Here we are using a special type called same as. Just like one of, this is same as. It's a special attribute, or rather a special operator that's available in Synth. And when we use a same as, we have to give a reference value. The reference is, we are saying in the same set of collections, there must be a collection called customer v4, within which look for the content element, and within which look for the sub element, which is customer UUID. So in a way, we are referencing one JSON from another JSON or one collection from another collection. And it's not just a reference of a collection. From a collection, we are drilling down to the actual attribute. So if you just look at this, customer v4, content, customer UUID. If I go back to customer v4, you'll see in content, we have the customer UUID. So this way, any data that's generated for address, it will make sure that the values are the same as this another collection. So let's see this in action. Go back to synth commands. I'm going to copy this data, and here in this data you can see we are only generating data for address underscore v1. Let's copy this, and in the command line we will increase the size from 30 to 100, and let's hit enter. So you can see some data has been generated and there were no errors whatsoever. So let's go back to the database and refresh the address v1. So some data is already available there. If I click on view data, you can see the data appear here. So you see a customer UUID and an address that's appearing. So what's nice here is that the primary key, foreign key has already been enforced, and Synth did not throw any error, or rather the database did not throw any error while accepting this data, which means the UIDs that have been generated here are already in sync with the customer v4. Now, rather than just looking at this data, let's run a script and verify this, right? So I'm going to run a select query, select star from customer v4, join it with the address table on, or let's say using customer underscore UUID. Now you can see immediately it returns data. You have the customer UUID, the customer ID, first name, last name, customer's gender. The first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 attributes are from the customer table, and the last one, the address, is of course from the address table. So you can see the data that was generated at different times is still, you're able to join them together across these two tables, and that's the beauty of Synth. And in my perspective, it's a very, very powerful feature when it comes to generating mockup data. Doing something like this would have taken ages. And believe me, like I have first-hand experience. I've generated data for a million records across a couple of tables using Excel. That was back in the day when Synth and other tools did not exist. It was a lot of effort, not only in generating the data, but even greater, the effort was to apply the constraints, making sure data was unique, making sure the data between tables were matching, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, Synth really makes it look like a walk in the park. It's very simple, yet very powerful in the control that it gives over the data generation. So those were all the commands that I wanted to show you. Now a quick look at their documentation. They have some really good documentation. It's very easy to follow. So I would highly recommend that you go through their documentation page. And in their documentation page, if you click on the string under generators, you will see details about all the different kind of generators that it supports and how you can use them. So you can already recognize the first name, last name, and few others that we used in this video. Also very important, please, let's take some time to appreciate the kind of effort that has gone into building this tool. So there are these wonderful people across the globe who are volunteering to develop this program, which is so good and definitely is going to make a lot of our life easier. So let's take a moment to appreciate their effort and also to star their GitHub repo so they get the the recognition that they deserve. So with this, we have come to the end of this video. As you can see, Synth is an amazing tool, very simple to use, very easy to learn. And I think every ETL tester and database developer has to learn this tool because it's going to make their life a lot easier. If you found this video useful, well, give it a like, share it with your friends and colleagues, and subscribe to my channel. Thank you and catch you in my next video.